Good afternoon, dear members of Abrar Global, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ivaylo Tassev, and this is my topic. It's called the problematic concept of sovereignty within the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. How ISIS viewed the concept of sovereignty. Actually, ISIS wanted to achieve a full sovereignty to be a sovereign state, a sovereign actor in the international system. But this willingness, this wish was actually far from being achieved. Introduction. What are the main points of my article and my presentation? The first one is the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty originates from the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century. The Treaty of Westphalia was a treaties of peace between religious groups in Europe who were fighting for a long time. Europe had experienced a lot of wars, but those treaties put an end to those religious wars, and peace was established. Also, the church was not anymore a legitimate authority over the state. Political figures, political leaders were the ones who had to rule the state. Actually, the treaties of Westphalia brought the notion of sovereignty. The state is the single unit which can rule over its citizens. The state is the one which governs this territory and population. Like before, the Pope, the Church, was the supreme authority, but now the state. A state is like a territory which has its own government, politics, territory, population, and the state, the political regime, was the one to rule over those boundaries. So the next concept is sovereignty within the vision of ISIS, how ISIS viewed sovereignty. ISIS promoted this idea, but they could not achieve it. And how does ISIS today, actually ISIS doesn't exist, but how do they view like this concept? This concept is far from achievable because ISIS does not exist anymore and it relies on local branches. So, my literature review. Let me give you first some background about the origin of Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, like it originated from its predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Like, you know, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a group fighting with the Americans during the war in Iraq. And it was led by al-Zarqawi, who was later killed. Al-Baghdadi was the one who led the group afterwards. And actually al-Baghdadi wanted to establish a state, a single state over those territories of Iraq and also Syria. An Islamic state based on pure Sharia laws, pure Sharia principles, Sunni and Salafist principles. He hated the Shias, the West, the Jews, the Christians, and he wanted to create this entity, this state, called Islamic State. The name changed a few times, but finally it acquired the name Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. In the next few years, ISIS became very powerful and acquired a lot of territories. This is al-Baghdadi, who proclaimed himself as a caliph, a leader, and he said he was a descendant of Muhammad, the prophet, and he established this so-called caliphate. Discussion and conclusion. What is sovereignty? As I mentioned before, sovereignty comes from the treaties of Westphalia. The state became like the most powerful actor in the international system. Like a certain territory with defined land, territory, and population can be called a state. Before, for example, in Italy and Germany, we had nation states who were fighting with each other, but a state is a certain area with its own government, territory, population. And the treaties of Westphalia, they established this theory that a state can govern itself. States can also enter into relations with other states. This is the Treaty of Westphalia between political leaders. The church was not anymore a supreme authority, but there was a head of state. How did ISIS view sovereignty? Actually, ISIS, as I said, wanted to create a state, a full, complete, self-governing, self-reliant state. In the beginning, it almost managed to achieve that. ISIS had its territory, population, citizens. It had its own economy, political administration, leaders, military even, banking services, taxation. However, it was very repressive. It was centered on terrorism, violence. It rejected other states as well. It wanted to fight with other states. So therefore, the international community did not recognize Islamic State. Islamic State was almost there to be a full state, but just it lacked international acknowledgement, international recognition. Yeah, this is a map of ISIS encompassing Iraq and Syria. What about nowadays? ISIS ceased to exist. It wanted to create a state, but then it was beaten, it was defeated, so actually it doesn't even exist today. However, it has its own branches, its own subsidiaries called vilayets in different parts of the world. For example, Islamic State Khorasan province in Central Asia, a Sahel region in Africa, and some other parts. So ISIS is still active, but it has independent units. Those independent units are called vilayets. Vilayet means provinces. So ISIS wanted to create a state before based on territory and population. However, it was defeated. What about now? Now those units or vilayets, they have abandoned the idea of sovereignty. This idea doesn't exist anymore. Those units actually want to fight governments and other religious authorities through guerrilla attacks, guerrilla tactics. What is guerrilla warfare? They want to make surprising attacks, assaults, like the one in Iran from January 2024 this year, the one in Moscow from March this year. So whenever there is a political religious rally or any other event, ISIS comes by surprise and cause like panic, suicide bombings, many people get killed and injured. So the concept of sovereignty is not existent anymore. This is a map of some of the ISIS units being active. Like very dangerous is the Islamic State Khorasan province in Central Asia. In conclusion, ISIS in the first stages promoted the idea of sovereignty coming from Westphalia, saying that the state is the single actor, the single most powerful actor in the international system. The state can exercise authority over its citizens and territory. The state is the supreme leader. ISIS promoted this idea, but it could not achieve it. Why? Because it was a terrorist organization based on repressions and terrorism. Now, those units have abandoned this idea because ISIS doesn't exist. Its units or subsidiaries rely on guerrilla warfare. they do not anymore follow this concept of sovereignty. So the concept of sovereignty is totally absent today and was absent before. It doesn't exist within the vision of Islamic State. Thanks.